that might be time to kick off. Thank you for coming, everybody, tonight. My name is Ian Brunswick. I'm the head of programming at Science Gallery. And this is Toxic Access, Artistic License in Ireland. And this is the second event we've had of this kind, where we kind of have an open discussion about our process here, about an issue that may have come up, and something that will hopefully inform our practice at Science Gallery. But we also want to have that discussion with experts who can comment on what we should do in this scenario, but also hear from you and hopefully answer your questions and concerns about this as well. So I'll introduce our speakers and then also just give you a little bit of background on this event. So joining us tonight, first of all, will be Roja Fazaeli, Assistant Professor of Islamic Civilizations at the Near and Middle Eastern Studies in TCD. We have Neville Cox, who is the Dean of Graduate Studies, Associate Professor of Law at Trinity College Dublin, and also a practicing barrister. We have Umar Al-Kadri. He's the head imam of Al-Mustafa Islamic Educational and Cultural Centre in Ireland and the chair of the Irish Muslim Peace and Integration Council and the Islamic Centre in Ireland. And Maura Conway. She's a professor of law and government at DCU, and she's a researcher at VoxPol, which is a major EU FP7 funded academic network focused on researching online extremism and terrorism. So our panelists will introduce themselves a little bit, but I want to give you a little bit of background on this event and why it came about. Who's seen Design and Violence so far? Have you had a chance to look at it? Okay, about half of you. So in putting this exhibition together in collaboration with Museum of Modern Art, we were discussing what is design and what is violence, and also what should be in the show and what shouldn't be in the show. So most of the time we were considering what counted as design and what we interpreted as falling into that category and violence. But we did encounter a few pieces where we were wondering, is it responsible to exhibit this, or is it relevant? Can we give the correct context to give it a good treatment? And also, with our audience in mind, should we show it? And one of the pieces that came up when we were discussing design and violence was designs that incite violence or aim to incite hatred, for example. And one of the things that came up was the magazine of, there we go. Let me go back. The magazine of Islamic State, Dabiq. And I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it's available online, sometimes via the dark web, but you can also get it online. And it's quite a glossy, oddly glossy magazine that basically espouses their thinking and tries to recruit and popularize what they do. And this whole event, we're not going to discuss just this, but it was the kind of genesis for this discussion. And what struck me about this piece and why I went to each of our panelists to discuss this was that when you look at the magazine, there's obviously what you might expect inside, some quite violent imagery, totally hate-filled tirades, but there's also quite glossy portrayals of people who've committed awful crimes. And then the weirdest thing for me was there was a 3-page health spread, which looked like it could have come out of Time Magazine or Newsweek, and it had charts on their dialysis units, and it was using familiar imagery, at least to me as a sort of a Western media consumer, to try and legitimize or try to familiarize this messaging, which I wouldn't have been as familiar with. And it struck me as something I didn't expect to see coming out of Islamic State. And so we had a discussion about, is this something we should include in the show? Should we be including this magazine as an example of design and violence, design which is aiming to incite violence? And it did raise some legal questions, it raised some moral questions, and about responsibility. Is it legal to show this? It is quite a hateful piece of documentation. Is it responsible to? It's probably not good to just hand this out on the street as if we're promoting it, because that could be misunderstood. So I talked to each of our panelists about this, but it did raise a greater question. How should cultural institutions, especially Science Gallery and others, deal with things which are controversial in this way, and how should we deal with them responsibly, especially in this show where we aren't trying to glorify violence or promote a message of violence, but we are trying to give people the critical faculty to think about how design and violence interact. So that's a very kind of long-winded intro to this one piece which provoked this discussion. And I will say that in the end, we decided not to show it in the show, and I'll explain our reasoning later, but I want to hear from the panelists on what they thought would be the right decision. But I think it's worth for us to consider what would we do in the future if something like this comes up, or if any of you are involved in the cultural sector, what would you do with a similar artifact or object? So with that as kind of the premise, I might ask each of our panelists to say a little bit about what they do, their background, and if they have any other experiences that they think are relevant or kind of inform their opinion on this matter. So first, over to Roja.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Roja Fazeli, and I lecture in Islamic civilizations in Near and Middle Eastern studies. A lot of my research is around questions of human rights, women's rights, and a few years ago I wrote a paper on female suicide bombers, looking at female suicide bombers in kind of female suicide bombers / martyrdom seekers. So both looking at these definitions and also looking at the women's agency to see, are these women themselves taking part in these operations, what are kind of the socioeconomic, cultural, kind of peer pressure, what's the context of it. And I actually teach a course on Islam and gender, and part of 1 week we actually look at female martyrdom seekers / suicide bombers, and I show them videos from Hamas, and there's some of the last testaments of the suicide bombers on YouTube. So the students watch those and they discuss it. I also teach a course on Islam in Europe, and it's also part of my research. And so the Muhammad cartoons from Iliad Poston to Charlie Hebdo. We talk about those. We actually this is where it becomes complicated. I didn't think about this legally at all the last few years, and I've been teaching for 8 years. In the last 2 years, it's become more sensitive. So I asked, instead of just showing the cartoons, I asked my students, would it be okay for me? Are you okay with me to show you the cartoons? And then now next semester, I teach a course on contemporary Islamic movements, and I really want to use the magazine Dublin as primary source. But there are questions on how to access it myself, how to disseminate it to my students. So I emailed the faculty, the chair of the ethics committee in my faculty, Arts and Humanities, and asked, I said, look, I'm both interested in teaching this, and also I want to do research because a continuation of the female suicide bomber martyrdom seekers. And they kind of went, whoa, we can't answer this. Go to the college research committee. And I'm still getting an answer. So it seems kind of, it's quite, it's changing, and it's something for me. It affects my work, and how much sensitivity should I show to it? So these are all questions that I'm dealing with my everyday work, really.
Thanks. Yeah, and Neville.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm currently doing graduate studies, but in real life I'm a professor in the law school, and in practice I work predominantly in the area of libel law, defamation law. And I suppose in terms of where I'm teaching now and where I'm writing, it's virtually all connected with speech law and with Islamic law, actually. The tie-in for me has been the issue of blasphemy as well. And I suppose when I look at these things, I'm kind of conscious of two factors. First of all, I'm conscious of the fact that in the culture in which I operate, which for the last 2,000 years has assumed that it knows best on matters of moral judgment, albeit that it changes its mind fairly regularly. Currently, the use of the language of rights is the metric by which we measure legitimacy. And so, therefore, in terms of assessing whether or not this kind of material should be displayed or whether it legally can be constrained, we reach into the language of rights, and specifically into the language of freedom of expression. And I suppose what my inquiry has been in terms of my work is whether I am happy to accept the legitimacy of the proposition which says that censorship is an inherently bad thing and that freedom of expression should be protected on a near absolute basis. I suppose I increasingly come to the view that there are more interests than merely freedom of expression in a situation like this. And I think that all societies put certain things offline, that there are certain magic words which all societies deem unacceptable, having regard to the heart of their public moral vision. So one of the things that I ask students, I do this to junior freshman students because they're the most vulnerable, and I ask them in this context of whether offensive speech can be restricted, I ask them to go away and think of the most offensive words that they can think of. Not the most offensive phrase, because "you're an idiot" is probably the most offensive phrase because it's so demeaning, but words which are unsayable. And inevitably there are two words which are unsayable. The first word, the C word, which is in cancer, is becoming increasingly sayable. But it's the other word, it's the N word. And I say to students, and probably this should be an offence for which I should be fired, but they can't because I've got tenure.
We're live streaming, just so you know.
Crap. I say to them, okay, look, what's this word you're scared of? And they say, it's the N word. And I say, would you be prepared to say it in a kind of totally clinical setting? Would you be prepared just to say the word? And 9 times out of 10, or if I'm teaching Americans, 10 times out of 10, they won't say the word. And it seems to me that this is because certain words and certain phrases have empirical, magical powers for society and are put offline. Not because they offend individuals, although they do, but because they hurt the heart and soul of the nation. Whether it's Holocaust denial in Germany, whether it is hate speech in Western Europe, whether it is blasphemy in certain Islamic countries. And I think that censorship has a bad name in this country because you have a situation where there's been such a moral revolution over the last 60 years, from a public morality based on very conservative sexual constraint through to a public morality based on human rights and respect for the dignity of all people. We all believe that our existing public morality represents truth. So when we look at former censorship laws, or when we look at the current Irish blasphemy law, what we're seeing is a censorship based on a public morality that no longer exists. But I wonder whether it's perfectly legitimate for society to say that it must assert its own moral values, its own public moral values, and in doing so, the control of speech is a primary port of call, simply because of its utilitarian value. And that's my inquiry at the moment. And it's something which I'm increasingly being drawn towards, that it's perfectly legitimate for a society to say that whereas not all speech which offends all people can be restricted, because that would be a restriction of all speech, nonetheless there are going to be certain things which are so fundamental in the way they challenge the public morality of a state that they become unsayable.
Thanks, Neville. Umar, would you like to say a few words?
Good evening, everyone. I am Umar Al-Kadri. I am the chair of the Irish Muslim Peace and Integration Council and the Imam of the Islamic Centre Ireland, which is based in Blanketstown, not the one in Clonskeagh. First of all, I'd like to thank the Science Gallery for inviting me, because I'm here not as an academic, I'm here as a voice of the community that is the most affected by Daesh and its propaganda. And when I look at this magazine, it is a magazine that the vast majority of the Muslims see as a magazine that not only misrepresents, misquotes, and decontextualizes texts of the Quran and Hadith, but also aims to make the community that already is in one way or another feeling that it's not acceptable, it's not welcome in the society anymore. It makes them vulnerable to radicalization. So this piece of magazine is something that is affecting us the most. And as an imam, and as someone who is one of the voices of Islam in Ireland, I have dealt with individuals that have come to me with the magazine, references from the magazine, which screenshots from it, and, Sheikh, this is what it says in this, and what does the Quran say, what does the Hadith say, look at this reference. So I've dealt with it, and I know the dangers of it. And how do you deal with it? So when I am asked about it, should we display it here or not? It's the same thing as I would say in an Islamic center. Would you display this magazine in an Islamic center or not? I would say it depends on who is the audience. It depends on, what is your aim and objective. Because in the Islamic center, we have, for example, classes for adults where we have this magazine and we actually talk about it. We talk about, look, this is a reference quoted in this magazine, and it's wrong because it's out of context. And we then give the answer to what do we think and how does this misinterpret the tradition of Islam. So we do show it. We do show it to the members of the Muslim community, but not everyone, of course. It's not there on public display. It's not there that you enter the Islamic center and you can find the magazine. No, it's only in the classes of Islamic studies where adults are taught. So similarly, my view is that if the purpose of it is to display it just so people can find out about it, well, then you're giving oxygen that ISIS and Daesh really needs. It needs the oxygen to survive, and then you're providing it. But if you're doing it for the purpose of education and to educate people about the dangers of it, but you're also giving them a balanced view, or you're also giving them the other view of the Muslims, the mainstream Muslims, the majority of Muslims, that this is not how they understand the Quran, this is not how they understand the reference, then I think I don't have a problem with it. So it's conditional. So this is where I'm coming from. We also in the Islamic Center hold seminars on the dangers of online radicalization, where we in fact again show various different texts quoted in this magazine and on other websites. I last year founded a website called jihad.info. And the whole purpose of it was because a lot of, in this magazine, online we find a text of the Quran, a text of the Hadith, out of context, presented in a way to inspire people to violence. And how do you address that? How do you refute that? The only way is to, again, we thought with this website to give them the other view. And similarly, whether you want to, whether you need to or you want to display this magazine or not, I think, again, it is, in my view, and the view of many Muslims that I've spoken to, they wouldn't necessarily say, don't do it. They would say it depends on the aim, it depends on intention, it depends on the conditions of it. Okay? Thank you.
Thanks, Umar. And Laura.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so I'm Professor of International Security in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University. I'm responsible, like Ian said already, for a major EU-funded project on violent online political extremism. And we're interested in the whole gamut of violent extremists who are active on the internet. And I guess at this stage, almost every type of violent extremist that you can conceive of has some kind of online presence. I guess in more recent times, we have focused on the so-called Islamic State and their online activity. And in media, I think what you'll see it described as quite a lot of the time is as being very slick. And I guess this goes to this design element. And it's not just in DABIC, so in this particular magazine that this organization produces, but actually they produce a whole range of other content that they circulate via the internet. And they've put an enormous amount of resources in terms of time and people and money into this online strategy that they've developed. And I guess what we could determine from that is they put quite a lot of store by media, not just actually online, but in the areas that they control in Iraq and Syria. For example, they have widespread on-the-ground media strategies also. But they clearly feel like, in terms of their online, let's say, they clearly feel like it's having some kind of an impact. It's a little bit hard to determine what impact they're actually after, but for policymakers in Europe and elsewhere, I guess the concern is that people, consume this content, so they access this content, they consume it, they can network around it online and discuss with like-minded others, etc., and that some of those people might be encouraged to either travel to join the so-called Islamic State in Iraq or Syria, or indeed they are at the present time, and they have been for some time, encouraging people to carry out attacks in Western countries, etc. And that's the kind of concern of policymakers and others. So we're interested as researchers in, I guess, this question of what their purpose is. In terms of this content on the one hand, what the effects of it might be on the other hand, and what are, viable and responsible responses. So when Ian contacted me, I thought it was quite interesting, this question of, should you show it or should you not show it? But I think I agree with Omar and others. I think it does depend very much on context. From a researcher perspective, for example, I think there's very few things, if anything, really, that we should sort of draw a line under and say, well, we're not going to address this, because I think there is a certain responsibility as researchers and in university settings, etc., to address the whole gamut of ideas and to explore them and analyse them, etc. I think the context is indeed very important.
I think that the notion of context came up again and again about presenting it, discussing it. That it was, whether it was responsible or not, came down to context a lot. But I remember on the first phone call with you, I did ask you. I said, do you know if it's legal for me to be looking at this or downloading it? Because it seems like a pretty, awful thing that would fall potentially afoul of incitement to hatred acts. And that was before I talked to Neville. So one question I might ask you, Neville, as well, is the legality on this clear, either in consumption? I assume in discussing it and showing a couple screenshots I'm okay, but would an exhibiting of it have any potential legal ramifications, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think that obviously the magazine itself is, as published, is an incitement to hatred, but the question is whether you, as a publisher of it, would be guilty of incitement to hatred in publishing it in a clearly clinical setting and entirely contextualised. And I've no doubt that, it's not impossible that, you might be prosecuted, but I've no doubt that, I think, no, I can get you a really good lawyer. But I've no doubt that under the Act it wouldn't constitute incitement to hatred. It's not, in order for something to constitute incitement to hatred, it must be intended to or likely to stir up hatred. And the reality of the situation is this isn't going to happen in this context. I actually genuinely wonder about this in any event. The reality seems to me is that if someone is predisposed to hate someone, they don't need a magazine being displayed in the science gallery to incite them to this. I think it highly unlikely that someone operating in a relatively neutral context emotionally towards someone would come to an exhibition like this, see the magazine and say, God, that completely changed my mind. Now I really kind of hate the infidels. It just seems so inconceivable that I don't think it could possibly constitute incitement to hatred. That's not necessarily a statement that it should have been displayed. And there might be other reasons why there might be controls of it in terms of public order and public security and so forth and so on. but as an incitement to hatred thing, it seems the link, to me, your potential publication of it, I would have thought the link is very specious.
That does raise an interesting point that came up earlier, though, hatred of whom, and one thing we got into was, while we might not, showing this magazine might not convince anyone to say, wow, ISIS has a great point, it might do the converse and convince people that this is what a lot of Muslim people think, and do the flip side and incite hatred in a reverse kind of way. I mean, this was something you were mentioning that even kind of came up in that strange Swedish case you were talking about.
Exactly. So when you called me, Ian, and we had a conversation about various issues, and one of the things was that you mentioned this kind of legal issues and whatnot, and I began to think about in the context of, say, for example, terrorism acts, terrorism legislation and that kind of thing, and not about hate legislation. That didn't really occur to me. And in the UK, for example, there is legislation that is relevant to these kind of publications. So in the UK Terrorism Acts 2000 and 2006, there are various portions that address disseminating publications, and there have been cases, there's a number of relevant cases now. What has transpired is that you do indeed have defence, and it's in the legislation, of sort of legitimate aims. So if you were a researcher, for example, you would be entitled to make that kind of defence, and probably a cultural institution also. And in fact, the case law shows that people have been questioned, etc., about possessing these documents. But in fact, most of the case law seems to say, okay, you need to go further. You need to do something else. Possession is not sufficient in the UK context, and you would need to disseminate for, like you said, specific types of purposes, not benign cultural or other purposes. But you raised with me, so I was thinking along these kind of lines, terrorism legislation, etc. But then Ian said to me about, hate speech laws, etc. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And after I put down the phone, I thought, I wonder hatred towards whom? I thought to myself afterwards, and I thought, well, there's two sides of this, right? It could be, it certainly is, that IS, the so-called Islamic State, are seeking to create hatred, feelings of hatred amongst their adherents to actually a very wide swathe of people, certainly other Muslims, whole variety of other Muslims, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims. They're very serious sectarians, for example. But also other ethnic minorities in the region, the Yazidis, for example, Christians, Jewish people, a whole host of others, and then more widely the West, etc. So that's one aspect of the hatred, potentially. But there's also the way in which, as Ian just pointed out, it could make other people, reading this magazine, could make other people believe that these are mainstream views amongst Muslims, and thereby cause other people to hate Muslims. So there's actually a case in Sweden that sort of touches upon these issues, because there was a guy who used the Islamic State logo as his Facebook profile picture, and he was prosecuted. And there was a decision in the case just recently, and the guy did not, it wasn't a successful prosecution. And the thinking was this, that in fact, going to what we just discussed, the judge said, look, hate laws are about somebody or a group of people directing hatred against another group of people because of some characteristic that they had. But they said this guy couldn't be prosecuted because, in fact, Islamic State's hatred is so widespread that it's against everybody. And so that hate speech laws didn't apply. Now, it's caused a bit of a furore in Sweden and elsewhere, but I was reminded of Ian's question to me in the context of that.
Yeah, and I mean, that fear of being prosecuted is at least, it crosses your mind when you're talking about something like this. And I know, Roja, you said you were talking to the ethics committee, but you clearly think there is a value, at least in your module, to showing something like this. What do you think is the value in at least in an educational setting, discussing media like this?
I think it's in educational settings where you have to discuss this, because you have to, you say, to exhibit it in the science gallery. Like it's the, what do scientists do? They study the subject, they dissect, break down the unknown compound. You do the same in social sciences. So if you don't engage with it, how are you going to understand it? And I think part of the problem with having so much problem with kind of whether we want to display Dabegh or not is this fear of the unknown. Is fear of, if we do this, are people going to think that this is Islam? And it's kind of this othering of Islam, this kind of Islamophobic narrative that's out there already. So there's two sides of it. Are you going to incite hatred? Are you going to radicalize people? And then the other side is this going to impact on having more Islamophobia? And there's, as I think, like we are all saying the same thing basically. Like it's how you do it. So so if I do it in my class, we are going to discuss. We are going to discuss how does this radicalize? How is this incitement to hatred? What is it about it that if you look at it, you kind of if you look at this slide that's up there, you think it's very normal almost, that there is a human aspect to it. Is there a human aspect to it? So for example, on the legal side, European Parliament has ruled that the crimes that Daesh, ISIS, has committed against the minorities, the Yazidis, the Christian religious minorities, is seen, and ethnic minorities, is seen as genocide. So is it incitement to genocide even? Can you go that far? But you need to be able to discuss all of this. So if we don't discuss it, if we don't have it in the science gallery, which is part of a cultural institution, university setting, or if we don't discuss it in class, then who is going to discuss it? It's going to be like, this is the unknown. So that's kind of.
What do you think like a responsible exhibiting of it? Because I mean, we're in a closed room, with a small audience discussing it in depth. What do you think a responsible exhibiting would be? We
talked kind of prior to this with Maura and Omar as well, and we think again, like we all think the same, that it has to be done in a context. So you're not displaying this saying this is Islam, because really it's not. It's not. This is the other thing. Like Daesh is very a-religious. It doesn't represent Islam. It's political. It's you can give it different labels, but you can't give it the label of Islam. So if you have it in a context, that then you have also kind of a display of the historical and cultural narratives of Islam around it. Even if you have like pieces of the Quran and the Hadith literature that counteract their claims, then you're saying, well, this is not what Islam represents really. It's it's centuries, thousands of years of culture there. There is so much diversity from within. So I think if you contextualize it, you can display it very responsibly. Not to display it is irresponsible, I think.
Mm-hmm. Could I come back on that? Because I think there's a broader context there which would slightly concern me, which is that Western media and Western society, for its own purposes, has constructed a context of Islamophobia. And I think that the message is fairly rife out there. If you think about phrases like Islamic fundamentalist constituting a terrorist, Islamist constituting a terrorist, the message is so mainstream now that I would have thought that it would be optimistic to think that even in a setting like this, you could contextualize the display and not run the risk of people saying, well, this is the Muslim message. It's not necessarily a reason to do it, but I was thinking, Roja, for your class, right? And of course you couldn't be prosecuted, but let's say...
You just want to prosecute someone.
No, I don't. I really don't. But let's say that some media outlet publishes a story saying Iranian professor of Near Middle Eastern study displays ISIS magazine in class. That for me is the bigger threat. It's the kind of reputational thing, and it's part of a broader context which I find just morally reprehensible.
Just anecdotally, in my Islam in Europe class, we were talking about Islamophobia, and I was at a conference a few days ago on Islamophobia, media representations of Muslims by Immigrant Council of Ireland, and journalists took photos of us on their board. And so one of the things I told my class to do was go online and see what you can find as Islamophobia. So two of the students came back and they said, Dr. Fazaili, actually, we're on the Pegida website, and you're on it. You're on the first page of it. So already I'm there. But on the other side, so you're so yeah, there you go.
Well, I remember speaking at a conference following the Charlie Hebdo. We both originally have spoken at a lot of them, but speaking at one of them, and I was saying, is there a sense in which we can legitimately look after the interest of people who are sensitive religiously by restricting speech like this? And the question, and it was in a perfectly academic setting, question was, well, we could take them more seriously if they didn't blow up everyone. And like that kind of context, I would have said, is so mainstream that I just worry about that.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, we didn't display it, and part of the concern, I have to admit, was, will we get attention for this being the show where we have an AK-47 and Dabiq, on display? Where it's the show where you can go see the magazine of the Islamic State. Would that be the only media pickup? And could it overshadow the show? And could it almost be totally blown out of proportion because we wanted it as one piece amongst many? So that, in reputational, but also, I mean, it did the tiny fraction of a chance. Crossed our mind of I think you phrased it as sort of public order and public safety. Could this, like Charlie Hebdo, could this potentially make us I don't know how to put it politely, but a target for someone who has an opinion about what we're doing that is quite extreme or motivated by very sort of strange motivations. That crossed our mind as well, and it perhaps had a chilling effect on what we eventually decided.
Yeah, I'd be more worried about the threat of hosting a football match, to be honest. There's much more likelihood of violence in this country being committed by white men with red hair than by anyone from the Muslim faith. And there's much more, very high chance of violence if you're hosting a football match, like violence amongst football supporters. That's the real danger, that and real IRA activity, and yet this becomes the focus. I don't know, I'd be really interested in your views on that.
Well, all the people that I spoke to within the Muslim community, ranging from medical doctors to taxi drivers, I mentioned on Friday on the Jummah prayer the possibility of displaying this magazine, and everyone had one concern that was very kind of common among everyone, and that was that will it not have the negative impact on the community, because already there is, as Roger has mentioned, Islamophobia. There is a lot of incidents that have taken place where Muslims have been targeted because of their appearance. Recently, I mean, something that very positive came up 2 days ago was Aer Lingus removed a man who was abusing other Muslim passengers. But that abuse actually is increasing, unfortunately, day by day. And the danger, or the concern of the community was, by displaying this magazine, will it not really then do the same thing? Will it not increase Islamophobia and attacks? So again, I think if it's contextualized, if you have a disclaimer that this is not what the majority of the Muslims believe, this is not their belief and understanding of their faith, then in that environment, there's a possibility, or we don't have an objection there. But I think in terms of, do we have a genuine threat here in Ireland from these extremists? Not really, no. And I would agree with Professor Neville Cox here that there is more danger of extremism from these extremists that have any sport affiliation than extremists from religious affiliation. There is more danger of extremism from a political background affiliation than from a religious affiliation. And sometimes, again, the media, the way they portray messages, the way sometimes reporting is done, sensationalized, it is very worrying, because it seems that every Muslim is possibly a terrorist, which is not the case. So again, I think people need to understand that, and by having this magazine displaying that there are pros, there are cons, there are advantages, disadvantages, and I think the great thing that a science gallery has done is at least to organize a debate and discussion on that we discuss all the different pros and cons about it. So in future, I mean, we've got Tabik now, and this is Islamic, or you can say violence that is related to Islam. But similarly, there are publications from political organizations, from other religions, people that claim to be adherents of other religions. And this question can come up in the future as well.
So we're just talking about one possible sort of hypothetical example here, but where is this being addressed well, especially in Ireland, since we're talking about both making sure that this is not portrayed as reflective of mainstream Islam, but also, especially for young people and sort of anti-radicalization efforts, what's being done to counter this, both keeping it off shelves, but also sort of informing them that this is not the way to go, and this is not indicative of reality either.
As I mentioned, within the community, there are there are de-radicalization classes and training programs that are provided to not only the students, in fact to the parents. We have had seminars where we had, on one occasion, we had a parent from England, from Bristol, whose 2 children traveled to Iraq and Syria to join Daesh. This is a medical doctor, and he had absolutely no idea that his children were radicalized online, and it happened, at home. And he just received a phone call suddenly one day from his children that were missing for the past 2 days. Dad, don't worry about us. We're doing this jihad. We're here.
Don't worry about us.
Yeah, don't worry about us. And just pray for us. We'll end up in paradise. But this is the thing, that that father, this particular individual, came to Ireland. We invited him so he could speak to other parents about his experience, and he could warn other parents also that radicalization does not necessarily take place face to face, but also online radicalization is a reality. At the same time, as I said, we have classes where we discuss the texts, the references that this magazine and others also on websites we do find of these radicals and extremists, and then we counter-attack that with the mainstream view of Islam, and how do we respond to that academically, intellectually. So we do that already within the Islamic centers or within these circles to make sure that if anyone of our community member reads this magazine, at least they know the context, they understand that this is the references are misquoted, they are decontextualized, for example, verses of the Quran taken out of context. And it's important that it's important that Muslims know about this, because again, there is a danger of falling into the trap, because faith is very important, is very, very significant, and Muslims are very passionate about their faith. And when somebody tells to you as a Muslim, this is what the Quran says. Even if someone is not a practicing Muslim, doesn't pray 5 times a day, but as soon as he hears something like, this is what the Quran says, he will just, he will accept it without really researching it, and that is a danger. So we ask our community members always, if somebody is presenting you evidence from and saying this is what the Quran says, please go to an Islamic scholar, go to and pick up the Quran yourself and read it yourself, and then contextualize it, and you will understand that, it's not how these people are presenting it.
That's very good.
Yeah.
I think we'll take some questions from the audience if anyone has any questions. Just up at the back here, and one down here. There's a microphone coming around to just the back corner there.
Can I ask the gentleman secondly from the Islamic? Thank you. Have you read completely this publication? Well, I wouldn't call it a publication.
Yes, I've read this publication a few times. In fact, we had a few meetings of Muslim scholars based in the UK and Ireland that we are part of a group where we meet and then we discuss, for example, this. So we had discussions in London on this, on the text, and then there were various different presentations on how to counter attack that. So I'm familiar with it, yes.
It's almost entirely, well, my impression is it's entirely online, and more,
Online.
I think you know about this as well, like it's an online-only publication, essentially. It doesn't have an ISBN or date or anything like that.
There are hard copies. So, like I said, so-called Islamic State have an online media strategy, but they also have an offline media strategy. So they do have hard copy publications that they're circulating within territories that they control. They have a newspaper, for example. It's distributed in hard copy, and other kinds of newsletters and that kind of thing. Also various CDs and DVDs and et cetera, et cetera. But this particular publication, DABIC, and also another organization with the same violent jihadi ideology called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, so AQAP, have another well-known English language magazine. It's called Inspire. Both of these are online publications, and they're targeted at a specific audience, which is English speakers, although they're also translated, actually, both of those publications into other languages too. But like I say, it's not for people within their territories or whatnot per se. It's for people globally who are active on the internet. So they're virtual publications.
I think we had another question down here, yeah? And then the second one over here. Yeah, if you wait for the mic, then they can hear you on the live stream.
Yeah, I just have a question I'm so sorry, I've forgotten all of your names, so I'm going to have to refer to you by your positions. You were just speaking there about the classes that you hold for de-radicalization and trying to give accurate information about these, to warn people about the effects of these kind of publications online. But those kind of things tend to happen. You have to say, you just talked about the need for context and the need to kind of control the way in which you're talking about these things, and it tends to mean that you have a very limited audience, and you tend to only, I imagine, do you only engage with people who want to engage with you? Is it very difficult to reach out to a broader audience and to kind of disseminate these things more widely, disseminate accurate information more widely in a context where, as the third person along from me was saying, there it's kind of toxic to talk about this in this way, because there is this wider context of Islamophobia. Sorry, that was. So
people are going to encounter it without this context, and you can only reach so many. Is that what you're kind of?
Yeah, I'm kind of saying there's an issue with. Yeah, people are going to encounter these kind of publications themselves, that you can't reach a very wide audience in this way by just holding kind of small controlled classes.
I will agree with you. One of the activities of the Irish Muslim Peace and Integration Council is not just to create awareness and educate the community itself when it comes to scripture and the correct understanding of scripture, or the understanding of the majority of the Muslims, but also to reach out to the larger community. And particularly the last few years, these kind of references and verses of the Quran that are usually, out of context. For example, kill the infidel wherever you find them. It's one of the verses that is often used, but it's absolutely out of context. Yeah. And what we do is to reach out to the larger community. We invite, we invite school groups, we invite various different organizations to our events. And during these events, we talk about, the understanding of Islam, and particularly we highlight verses of the Quran that are polemic or that are problematic or that are misunderstood by a lot of people and are used for these purposes. But I think what maybe can be done more in future, and again, it's resources. We are, as an organization, we are struggling with resources. We're not getting funding from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE or any other country. So one of the things that we really want to do is to hold seminars and conferences where we can, invite people from all various different backgrounds to come together and to talk about, this is what the Quran says, and you probably have heard it, kill the infidel wherever you find them, but hold on, what do Muslims believe about it? How do they understand this? And I think it's important to create that awareness, because a lot of people think Muslims follow the Quran literally, which is not the case. We do not follow the scripture literally. We always contextualize it. And if you follow it literally, any text, whether it is the Constitution of Ireland or it is the Quran, it can be very problematic.
There's far more references to violence in the Jewish Old Testament than there's in the Quran. Far more references, but no one speaks about Jewish terrorism.
And maybe I could also say, because I think maybe your point goes as well to sort of online. So people come across this stuff online, etc., and maybe where's the response in that kind of a setting where you might get this more general audience that you're referring to. And there are, in fact, more and more people concerned about doing sort of online. The terminology is either CVE or PVE now, meaning countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism. And there's lots of grassroots organizations. There's also grassroots initiatives like sort of hashtag campaigns and that kind of thing. But there's also increasingly work being done by social media companies, because pressure has been brought to bear on them for their kind of role in some of this. So for giving a platform to varieties of extremists, and so, for example, Google and YouTube have been involved in various initiatives. Facebook has gotten some attention in the last few weeks about some work that they're doing in this space, and there is a report about it that's available on the internet, and it's around advertising. So when people put in various search terms, they would advertise sort of CVE content to people at the same time, and to try and get them to click on that, I guess, also, and divert them or something similar. So people are trying to come up with sort of innovative sort of solutions in this kind of online setting to sort of see what they can do.
I think we have another question down here. There's also some very poppy kind of counter-extremist media that you sent on as well. Mm-hmm. So I think we posted some on the site for the event. So there's a couple of good examples there. Yeah.
Thanks. My question is actually for yourself as the programmer of the Science Gallery. Because I'm kind of interested in the fact that there's an overall assumption here that cultural institutions have a moral value system, or have a moral value system. And I'm wondering how, in the case of maybe the Science Gallery or in general, do you think that moral value system should be decided? Like whether it's through your funders or what the public consciousness is, or, I don't know, higher state bodies. And for example, just to kind of contextualize that question, interested in the fact that you've got a repeal jumper in here, and wondering if this would have been in the exhibition a few years ago before it reached kind of such a high degree of public consciousness and public support. And if not, then to what extent do cultural institutions, instead of kind of pushing new issues into public consciousness and pushing a more progressive kind of line, just reflect already existing public consciousness? And that's my kind of
very good question.
Good question.
That's a great question. So the last bit of your question, I think, is important, and where it's really good to call out bullshit on a lot of brands, cultural institutions, but also corporate institutions that appropriate sort of cultural movements. So on the last part of your question, I think you see a lot of not as much with cultural institutions that are jumping on the bandwagon of progressive movements that are just more acceptable now. But you do see this with, after the marriage equality referendum, the amount of brands, especially like beer brands, that were suddenly featuring that movement in their commercials in some way, and their advertisements was astounding. And where were they before that movement actually was successful? They weren't there. You see this in some, for example, Guinness advertising that features people from the global south looking either quite fashionable or sophisticated or extra Western for a kind of global audience to perceive in an unexpected way. That's only happening quite recently, when it's quite uncontroversial to do so, and is not going to actually move any progressive agenda. But the moral compass of an organization, I think for Science Gallery and cultural organizations that feature the work of artists, I think it's a little bit less about our cultural compass, although we do encounter like moral quandaries and ethical kind of problems, as this is about, and more about featuring artists who are asking tough moral questions. So art has always been political, and that's nothing new. I think the guys at Project Art Center really phrased this well after the whole mural came down, that this is nothing new, that they're featuring, letting artists have a platform to ask tough political questions. The repeal jumper, I don't think it would have been in the show a couple years ago only because it didn't exist. We are not featuring it. No, I don't mean to be sort of tautological or glib. We are featuring it because it is a design object about a current debate about violence. We're not featuring it to take a stand, and if you notice right next to it is the Eighth Amendment, and that is the first printing of the Irish Constitution and Statute book, printed in 1983, which was the first printing of that. We couldn't actually get the signed statute which put into law. The Supreme Court, the OPW, the Law Library, and the Oireachtas Library all were unable to assist us in acquiring those documents. So this is from the Trinity College Dublin Library. But we are not taking a stand on that. We are featuring two elements of design about the Eighth Amendment. One, which was the original design of it. And if you read on that page, there's already a critique about the ambiguity of it. Not critique of the politics of it, but the ambiguity. So I would say it was bad design about an issue of violence. And the repeal jumper, which is a current design response to it, which I think is relevant for this exhibition because it is a very much designed object. It's tying into a design sort of thinking and style to talk about an issue of violence. So I really don't think Science Gallery is taking a political stand there, but we do make an effort to feature artists who are asking tough political and moral questions. But to be totally honest, as an institution, you're made up of individuals, you do have someone to answer to, and you're influenced by your own point of view and that by your the people who support you. But I think our own decisions on that are well separated from our funders. So I don't think we've ever had a funder sort of push back and say, I don't think it's appropriate what you're doing, and nor would we really engage with the funder in the first place who had an expectation that we would listen to them on that. I might be being ideal or idealistic, but I do believe that we really try and be responsible about that. And I think a lot of cultural institutions do, but you come up against this stuff sometimes and don't know what to do and have to ask the experts what to do.
I was thinking about this because you have, you go to museums and you have stuff displayed on Nazi Germany, on, Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, Stalinist Russia, Rwandan genocide. What makes that okay? Is it because there's a distance in time? It's like history past. You still have Nazi ideology out there. So, and this is what I was thinking with Daber that makes it different. It's perceived Islamicness, or if that's even a word, and and if that perception wasn't there, if Daber is seen as a magazine of a very violent, militaristic, a-religious group, maybe it'd be different. So if you take religion out of it, maybe we would think about it differently.
I think, it's so interesting whenever you see a violent attack happening somewhere, and the question is it a terrorist attack? And people are looking to the religious identity of the perpetrator as now the definition of what's a terrorist attack. It's really quite extraordinary.
Do we have one final question? I think we have time for one. If we do, no. Last chance. Okay. Well, any closing thoughts, or if you guys want to, I suppose, add anything now with the notion that we have not exhibited Dabik, but where should we, I suppose, go from here?
I think you should display it in another.
Garage lecture around it.
Yeah, exactly. Come to my lectures. But it made me. It's a really good event. It made me think about a lot of things. Like I think context is really, really important, and I don't mean the context of displaying this, but I was thinking about the other side of it, of propaganda. So I come from Iran originally, and when I was looking at this martyrdom paper, Women Martyrdom Seekers, Suicide Bombers, there is actually a museum in Tehran, and it's called the Martyrs Museum. And and you can just imagine the ideology that's being displayed there. And in that context, I find that very problematic, because there is a propagandist kind of angle to it. But here, like in Ireland, the context of Ireland is so different that there should be we shouldn't fear it, we should engage with it. And I hope we'll have future events and displays where we can engage with these ideas.
Maybe just in terms, we keep talking about context, I think there's two additional contexts that we haven't hit upon so much, which is that, number one, I do think there's a problem with the way in which the Islamic State's content, and maybe this magazine and some other magazines in particular, are held up, especially by the media, and therefore people have this idea that this is something wholly out of the ordinary. But like I said, every variety of violent extremist that is operating at the present time has an online presence. That's the first thing. But also, every variety of violent extremist that has ever existed has used whatever the technology is that's available at that time for communication purposes to communicate their politics as they see it. And that goes back hundreds, even thousands of years, in fact. And that includes, I guess, secondly, not just there are violent jihadi organizations, so not just Islamic State, there are a whole host of other violent jihadi organizations in existence, but also, of course, all types of other violent extremists. So I guess what I'm saying is, in terms of context, and I always think it's worth pointing out in this, in relation to terrorism and whatnot, almost nothing is wholly new. Almost everything has been here before. And in this respect, all terrorists, all violent extremists seek to communicate their views, through their violence, but very often they have to explain it, because the rest of us don't interpret the violence maybe in the way in which they would prefer. So they have to say quite a lot in addition to it. And so they use whatever communications technologies are available, TV stations, newspapers, photocopying machines, wall writing, what have you, in order to do that. So this is just part of that kind of trajectory.
Well, I think when you look or hear the word violence or extremism, terror attack, the first thing that comes in mind, unfortunately, is it related to Islam? Is it or not? In the US, more people die with gun attacks than through these extremists that claim to be Muslims. But unfortunately, every time an attack has taken place, the first thing that pops up, the first thing you think is nowadays, it's Islam, is Muslims. Therefore, I think you need to be very sensitive, very, very responsible when you display any such material that has a link to extremism, that is linked with, in any way, to Islam, rightly or wrongly. So therefore, it's important to have a balance. So to let people know that, this type of extremism is not just, found in people that claim to be Islam or Muslim, but this type of extremism you also find in these different ideologies. So therefore, if you do display this magazine, Dabiq, or any other magazine, I think it's important to display also other publications that have to do with extremism, with this kind of mindset, that are used for the same purpose, but that have, for example, a different background, or different religious or different political ideology. Okay?
So I suppose my overarching concern is with this concept of how to deal with radicalization and I worry that in saying, look, there's this newspaper out there which is propagandist in its nature, if we get rid of that, then our problem with radicalisation is over. I think there's a much deeper question which Western culture doesn't want to answer as to why people are predisposed to being radicalised in the name of something which is ugly and violent. And there are two suggestions which are often offered, and I think both really should be taken seriously, but both aren't. The first is poverty and social deprivation, and people having a vacuum in their lives, whether it's a spiritual vacuum or an intellectual vacuum or whatever, which radicalists can fill. The second is the notion that for some Muslims, they're predisposed to radicalization precisely because they are sick of centuries of being the butt of Western stigmatization and isolation. If you think about the Danish cartoons, do you remember the cartoon with the prophet with the turban with the fuse at the end of it? Now that was an absolutely explicit message that there was a connection, an inherent connection between the prophet and violence, and I would argue between Islam and violence. And that became mainstreamed, and the West defended it in the name of freedom of expression, where it would never have defended an equivalent comment which targeted homosexuals, which targeted the Jewish race, which targeted people on the basis of colour. I think if the West is serious about trying to deal with radicalisation, it's got to do more than simply target newspapers or magazines of this kind. I think it has to deal with the root cause of it, and I don't believe the West is predisposed to doing so because it's easier to have a whipping boy that they can beat and blame for their own problems.
Okay, I think that's a good, a good upbeat note to end it on. No, but I think a call to action, and I think we've discussed some really important issues here, and I won't say more because that was a great way to end it, and I hope you enjoyed it, but I think most of all, let's give a big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you guys for a great discussion, and thank you all for joining us.